Welcome to the second week of our new 17-week series, looking at the sparkling qualities of the Dharma Jewel, the teachings of the Buddha. And our first rejoicing is looking at the Buddha's very first teaching of the Four Noble Truths, which is going to take us up until the middle of May. And last week, Sthiranāga started us off by describing the first three of the Noble Truths. And today I have the delightful pleasure to begin our exploration of the fourth Noble Truth, that of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. But before we dive too deeply, let's just set the context for what I'm going to be describing this morning. Last week, Sthiranaga explained that the Four Noble Truths arise out of the Buddha's teaching on conditionality, namely that all things arise in dependence upon conditions. So let's just recap his explanation of the Four Noble Truths with a slide. Magic. So Sthiranaga used the original word dukkha rather than offering a specific translation. And we often hear the word suffering used as the translation for dukkha, but sometimes that can be misleading. So other words like unsatisfactoriness, discomfort, being ill at ease, are all ways to somewhat inadequately translate the word dukkha, which is why it is often best to just use that term untranslated. So Sthiranaga shared the different categories or types of dukkha described by the Buddha: birth, old age, sickness, death, which we're all familiar with, being in contact with what we don't like, being separated from what we like, and not getting what we desire, what we want. So the first Noble Truth just states that these are experiences of life. The second Noble Truth is that the cause of this dukkha is our craving for things to be different, craving for satisfaction from things, from people, situations that can never give us lasting satisfaction. And then just before everyone started to feel a bit gloomy, he revealed that the third truth is that there is a way to end this dukkha. And finally, the fourth truth, that way is the Noble Eightfold Path. So over the next 8 weeks, we'll be examining one aspect of this path in detail, starting with the first one today, which is entitled Perfect Vision. So let's have a look at the whole path. So these are the 8 limbs. I kind of like the word limbs rather than steps or stages, although I'll probably use all of those terms throughout this talk. So you'll notice I've created 2 columns, and that's because in Sangha, our teacher and our founder of Sthiranaga, in his original lecture series on the Noble Eightfold Path, which he gave in 1968, he described what he termed as a mundane path and a transcendental path, which Sthiranaga also mentioned last week. And the latter path being the one followed by those who have reached some insight into the nature of reality, and for whom many of the positive manifestations of the remaining 7 limbs will just be natural expressions of that insight, of that deep understanding. So in column 1, I've included the terms that you will often see associated with the Noble Eightfold Path, so slightly different translations. And in the second column are Sangha's names of the limbs of the Transcendental Path. So the final thing to remind us all is that the word path, as I mentioned earlier when I talked about steps or stages, can also be a bit misleading, because it suggests a linear movement, so one followed by the other, when actually we may be working upon and progressing in multiple areas simultaneously. Okay, thanks, Ed. So one way in which Sangha divides the Noble Eightfold Path is he describes it as a path of vision and a path of transformation. So the first limb, the one we're concerned with this morning, is the path of vision. And this can be seen as a phase of initial spiritual insight and vision. So I'm going to come back to that. And I'm also going to draw on another lecture by Bhante Sangha from 1976, which was entitled A Vision of Human Existence. And that, I like that because it provides a sense of the difference between right and wrong view, to give us a sense of the characteristics of right view, the first of those limbs in the mundane description of the path. I'm also going to describe some of the circumstances under which this initial insight may arise, including my own experience. And I'm going to mention several of the key Buddhist concepts that Sangha suggests we look deeply into and explore thoroughly to gain a glimpse of the truth. And then I want to finish with what for me is the most important aspect of the path of vision. Let's start with Bhante's description of right view as opposed to wrong view. And he uses a very simple analogy of the ordinary sense of sight. And he asks, what is the difference between having good sight and poor sight? So poor sight, he suggests, is sight or vision which is in the first place weak. So we don't see very far or very distinctly. Poor sight is also blinkered. It's restricted to a very narrow field. So again, we only really see what's in front of our face. And poor sight is distorted sight, distorted vision. So it's like when we look through the bottom of a bottle or when we try to look through very thick fog. So this is poor sight in quite an ordinary sense. So conversely, good sight is sight which is strong. It enables us to see a great distance and see very clearly, see very distinctly. Good sight is also unblinkered. It has a wide field of vision and is not limited to what is immediately in front of us. And then good sight is undistorted. So it sees things as they are without going through any distorting medium. So in the same way, view is weak, wrong view is weak. So wrong view doesn't have any energy behind it. And by this, we mean the energy of concentration, which of course comes from meditation, the integration of our energy through the process of meditation. Similarly, wrong view is blinkered. It's a view that only comes from our five senses and our rational mind, So it's highly limited because there's no attempt to look beyond what is right in front of us. And finally, wrong view is distorted. For example, it's distorted by our emotions. And I've noticed quite often during our morning meditation tune-ins that when the sun is shining, many people's moods are lifted and they suddenly start seeing things in their lives as being joyful and pleasant. And these are often the same things that they would have had a slightly gloomy view about if it's raining or cloudy. So there's no doubt that our emotions can impact our view of the world. And neither of those views are whether we're feeling happy or whether we're feeling unhappy. Neither of those are true right view because they're distorted. Our views can also be distorted by prejudices, and that may become arrived at because of our previous experiences or our upbringing, our education, our family, etc. So what about right view? What are the characteristics of right view? So right view is strong and powerful, having behind it the concentrated force of the energy we can generate and harness through the practice of meditation. So ideally what we're talking about here are higher states of consciousness, the dhyanas, which is a model for describing those higher states, which some of you will be familiar with. So right view doesn't remain on the surface. It penetrates deeply into the nature of things, and it allows us to see things clearly and distinctly. And right view is unblinkered. It's not confined by the rational mind. So right view allows us to see into the significance of symbols, of archetypes, of dreams, and again, deeply penetrate their meaning. And finally, right view is undistorted. It sees things as they are, as a mirror reflects, without the distortion or prejudice or the clouding from our emotions. Earlier, I described this right view as an initial spiritual insight and vision. And we often talk about having a glimpse of the truth, a glimpse of the transcendental. And it's this initial glimpse that is often what brings us to maybe start looking for something else in our lives, some deeper meaning in our lives. And sometimes we have no idea what it is we're looking for. We just have a deep sense that there's something more to our lives than we currently understand. And this initial spiritual insight may not be simply a glimpse of right view. It may actually be something more. Perhaps it's a flash of perfect vision, which Bhante describes. And this insight often becomes the motivation. It often provides the spark, the energy for us to begin to embark upon a spiritual journey. And if we're really fortunate, that lightning flash may lead us to the Dharma. So how does this come about? Well, there are many individual ways in which this initial experience can arise. It may be out of the result of some difficulty, some tragedy, maybe a bereavement or loss, something that really rocks our world. And just like a lightning flash, illuminates the imperfections of what had previously we had been clinging onto and maybe relying upon. We may have an altogether more pleasant experience, perhaps in nature, or through the arts, maybe music. Or it could be that something or someone inspires us. Some people experience this through prolonged study, a stretching and expanding of their normal intellect. And of course, it may be that as we begin to reach a certain maturity of years, and we begin to wonder about the purpose of our lives, maybe the 40 or 50 years we've spent working interspersed with a few holidays a year, and just begin to question whether this is all there is. Is this all life is about? So in my experience, it was meeting someone who simply embodied the qualities in life that deep down I aspired to. Now, of course, these moments, these phases in our lives may not be all that straightforward. So when I look back now, in a way, I experienced the fourth sight that Siddhartha, before he became the Buddha, is said to have seen before he embarked on his quest, before he went forth. So after he saw the graphic and challenging sights of sickness, aging and death, he saw a wandering holy man who had an air of serenity, poise and calm that just moved him very deeply. And when I was 17 and I had that experience, that first lightning flash, If someone had said to me that I was being attracted to a man who had serenity, poise and calm, I may well have punched them. But looking back over the decades, I can now see that this is what it was. This was the spark for me. This is where my initial motivation to follow the Buddhist path actually came from. And then, of course, from here, from that vision, from that view, that lightning flash, the rest of the Eightfold path, the path of transformations, begins to open out. And that will unfold, I'm sure, very beautifully for us on Saturday mornings over the next 7 weeks. So I mentioned the non-linear or the simultaneous way in which the path unfolds. And actually, as we start to tread the other stages of the path, those that transform our actions, our communication, our livelihood, and our mind through deepening meditation, then we return again and again to this idea of right view or perfect vision. So we use the capacity, that capacity to more deeply investigate and penetrate the nature of existence. So it's not a question of ticking off each limb of the path. Right view, yeah, done that. Right emotion, yeah, done that. So even after those moments of insight, it's important that we reapply that new clarity of our view. And here Sangha suggests some very important Buddhist concepts which we should continually return to and test our emerging and developing view against. So I wanted to mention some of these because they will be covered during this current series. So firstly, of course, we have the Four Noble Truths themselves. And I'm sure, as many of you may have done last week, we can all give a cursory nod to the intellectual understanding of the first three of these, which Sthiranāga talked about last week. But how many of us really see deeply into the nature of our own dukkha, our own unsatisfactoriness, our own suffering? Secondly, second area is the whole area of conditionality. And again, many of us will be familiar with the classic poetic statement, this being, that becomes, from the arising of this, that arises, this not being, that does not become, from the ceasing of this, that ceases. But how many of us see the deep truth of that without any distortion? Thirdly, there are the marks of conditioned existence, the lakshanas, that all things are unsatisfactory, have no inherent fixed unchanging nature, and are all impermanent. And fourthly, the law of karma, that all our actions of body, speech and mind have consequences for ourselves and for others. So they're just 4 areas that if we're serious about our Dharma lives, if we're serious about realizing a cessation to our own dukkha, our own suffering, we should keep returning to as our view of the nature of things slowly becomes clearer, stronger, less blinkered, and less diminished by the distortions of our emotions and prejudices. So I want to end by returning to, firstly, the experience of the Buddha, and then to my own experience. So you'll be familiar with the story of the Buddha as he sat under the Bodhi tree. After years of learning and mastering the meditation techniques of other great teachers, after further years of austerity where he deprived himself of basic nutrition and subjected himself to all sorts of pain, he finally sat down under the Bodhi tree and vowed to himself that he would not get up until he had realized awakening. And of course, we know from his own accounts in the scriptures that his mind was drawn back to a memory of him sitting under a tree, watching a field being ploughed. And he recalled that sense of calm, that sense of freedom. And of course, it was this that it's said to have finally triggered his breakthrough into enlightenment. So I'd suggest he returned to something like his original inspiration. Maybe that sense of calm he experienced under the rose apple tree was similar to that of the wandering holy man. And that's what I really wanted to say about right view, about perfect vision even. If we want to use that term in relation to experiences that we've had, and that is that the most important thing we can do is to ensure that we return to that initial inspiration and never lose sight of it. The experiences of those flashes of insight, those glimpses of how things are, or maybe how things could be, are incredibly important and highly positive. So we need to recall them regularly, not in a nostalgic, wistful kind of way, but in a way that keeps the flame of our heart's desire alive and burning brightly. And when things get tough and the spiritual energy in our sails starts to flag, it's not just about finding the next talk to listen to or the next book to read, or thinking maybe we've outgrown the Metabhavana and need a new fancy meditation practice. It's simply about returning to and re-exploring those genuine moments of inspiration. The Dharma life, the spiritual path, is not an easy one. We face multiple challenges against our desire to want to see things differently, to want to behave differently. And the pressure comes from multiple sources: the pressure to conform to the society within which we live, pressure from our family structures and relationships that we find ourselves in. And those challenges are very powerful and very real. And if we're truly want to reach the essence of the fourth noble truth, to finally free ourselves from the inherent unsatisfactoriness of life, we need to keep alive that initial inspiration, that perfect vision that has led us to the journey that we're on. Thank you very much.